It's encouraging to see that most of the prominent Democratic Party 2020 presidential candidates all support Medicare for all, at least in rhetoric. What they say matters, supporting Medicare for all vocally, even if I may be a little bit skeptical about whether or not they'd fight for Medicare for all. That is important, it does matter, and I do give them credit for that. But with that being said, since most of them are backing Medicare for all, what we have to do is be thorough, we have to be nuanced, and we have to distinguish between the candidates who are just supporting Medicare for all because they want to pass the progressive litmus test, and the candidates who actually would be willing to fight for Medicare for all. Now, as these candidates launch their 2020 presidential campaigns, they are making our jobs easier for us because they're making it very clear that they're not willing to fight very hard for Medicare for all. Last week, Kamala Harris backtracked on Medicare for all and talked about there being many paths towards Medicare for all, which is code for I'm willing to settle for something less than Medicare for all, and then we'll worry about that down the line. Well, if you have someone with that mentality who's not willing to fight for Medicare for all now, then you're not going to get Medicare for all because we need someone like Bernie Sanders who is willing to plant their feet firmly in the ground and not budge. No matter how much pressure they face, they've got to fight for Medicare for all and not back down. Kamala Harris last week revealed that she's not serious about Medicare for all. Kirsten Gillibrand the week before made it clear that she's not serious about Medicare for all because she would not be willing to get rid of the filibuster. Well, if you want any progressive policies to be passed, then why wouldn't you get rid of the filibuster? Republicans got rid of it for Supreme Court nominees, people who will serve on the Supreme Court for decades. But you won't be willing to get rid of the filibuster for a policy like Medicare for all that would actually save lives? Well, that tells me you're not serious about Medicare for all. And now this week, we have more candidates who are showing their cards. And this time it's Elizabeth Warren, who basically pulled a Kamala and said that she's also open to multiple paths when it comes to Medicare for all. Now, I called it like it was last week when Kamala Harris said this, and I said it was a flip-flop. Now, just because I like Elizabeth Warren doesn't mean I'm going to handle her with kid gloves here. I'm going to call this what it is. This is her backing away from Medicare for all. She may not be explicitly backing away from Medicare for all, saying I no longer support it, but what she's saying here is basically the hint that she's not going to be a true fighter about Medicare for all when it comes to Medicare for all. And this is something that I initially speculated about Elizabeth Warren. I didn't necessarily believe that she would be as vocal about fighting for Medicare for all as someone like Bernie Sanders would be, but nonetheless, she's kind of confirming that my instincts about her were correct. So in an interview with Bloomberg, she was asked about whether or not she would support the abolition of private health insurance companies under a Medicare for all system. She was asked twice and completely dodged the question, but the dodge isn't necessarily the thing that worries me. It's the way that she spoke about healthcare that worried me the most.
Is there room for private health insurance in your vision of the ideal American healthcare system?
So let's start with the battle we're having right now and talk about the things we need to be doing, because I don't want to lose sight of this.
Okay.
It's good to talk about our overall goal, and here's our overall goal. This is what distinguishes Democrats from Republicans. Democrats believe health care is a basic human right, and we fight for basic human rights. Our obligation is to make sure that everybody gets coverage at the lowest possible cost to all of us. So what does that mean? Right now, it means fighting the Republicans who are trying to sabotage the Affordable Care Act. We've got this lawsuit going on down in Texas where the Republicans are trying to do what they couldn't do with the votes, and that is trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, to make it okay to discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions, to cut off access to health care for millions of Americans. So job number one is to defend the Affordable Care Act. Job number two is to make changes where we need to make them right now. Changes to hold insurance companies accountable when they're trying to cheat people, when they're trying to scam people. Changes right now in what's happening with drugs, prescription drugs. We need to lower the cost of prescription drugs. 1 in 4 Americans say they can't take drugs that are prescribed to them because they can't afford to pay for them. I have, for example, here, a proposal for generic drugs, which are about 90% of all the prescriptions that people fill, to be able to bring those costs down to just a nominal cost. And the third, how do we get universal coverage? Medicare for all, lots of paths for how to do that. But we know where we are aiming, and that is that every American has health care at a price that they can afford, and that the overall costs in the system are held as low as possible.
But right now, your vision for Medicare for all, would it all be a public option, or would it include private insurance?
So right now we've got there are multiple bills on the floor in the United States Senate. I've signed on to Medicare for all. I've signed on to another one that gives an option for buying into Medicaid. There are different ways we can get there, but the key has to be always keep the center of the bullseye in mind, and that is affordable health care for every American.
So obviously, she dodged the question. She didn't want to state unequivocally whether or not she will or won't get rid of private insurance. And look, even if you are personally opposed to the abolition of private health insurance companies under a Medicare for all type system, what you should at least start with is getting rid of them, so that way when negotiations inevitably go to the floor and you're debating on whether or not, you should compromise on this area, you're starting the negotiations from a position of strength. So she starts by saying, we have multiple jobs as Democrats. First of all, we've got to defend the Affordable Care Act. I mean, I agree, but it's kind of too late for that. It's already essentially been gutted by Donald Trump and Republicans. It may have been death by 1,000 cuts. It wasn't like a big blow to it all at once, but nonetheless, the Affordable Care Act has been gutted. So, I mean, sure, do what you can to protect that. Don't make that your only focus when it comes to healthcare. She also says job number 2 is to make changes where we need to make them right now. Changes to hold insurance companies accountable. Changes right now in what's happening with drugs. Again, have no problem with that. She recently proposed in December a bill that would essentially allow for a public option when it comes to the United States creating their own generic prescription drugs. I unequivocally support that. I think that that type of legislation is game-changing. It would save lives, literally. No problems whatsoever with these first 2 jobs she says that Senate Democrats have. Where we start to get into problematic territory is when she gets into job number 3. Listen carefully to what she says here. I'm going to read her quote. How do we get to universal coverage? She says that's what's really important. Medicare for all. Okay, this is good. Now, she says this, quote, lots of paths for how to do that. But we know where we are aiming, and that is that every American has healthcare at a price that they can afford, and that the overall costs in the system are held as low as possible. Now, she also said that she signed onto multiple bills in the Senate, Medicare for all, a Medicaid buy-in, but she emphasizes, quote, always keep the center of the bullseye in mind, and that is affordable healthcare for every American. Now, why is this troublesome? I know that a lot of people might just instinctively think that I'm being nitpicky and I'm attacking her based on semantics, but when politicians say things, you really have to decode what they're saying, because oftentimes even people we like Elizabeth Warren, they will use doublespeak because they want to obfuscate about the point that they're really trying to make. So when Elizabeth Warren talks about getting to Medicare for all by, taking multiple paths, what that means is she's not serious about fighting for Medicare for all right now, because while she personally may view Medicare for all as an aspirational goal, something that we might want to achieve one day, well, for now, if it's easier for us to just quickly expand coverage by opting for a Medicaid buy-in, then we should do that. If a public option will have an easier time passing, let's just do that right now. But what happens when you choose to compromise on healthcare before negotiations even begin? Whatever you're proposing will get watered down even more. So let's say you start from the firmest Medicare for all position where you want to ban insurance companies from even existing within your version of Medicare for all. Well, that ultimately will get watered down. You may land at Medicare for all with supplemental private insurance. Just know that whenever you start negotiations, you need to start from the strongest position possible. Otherwise, you're not going to land where you want to land if Medicare for all is truly your goal. Second of all, when you say there are multiple paths to Medicare for all and you opt for something that's healthcare reform that's not Medicare for all, basically anything short of Medicare for all will be really difficult to achieve in and of itself. We saw how a right-wing healthcare bill, the Affordable Care Act, could barely pass. Republicans didn't support it. So if you waste all of this political capital you have fighting for something that's not Medicare for all, that will still leave people without healthcare, you're wasting your time. Because you could do more. You have this moment that you need to seize where 70% of the public is on your side. You have wiggle room. So that way when the propaganda starts, even if you lose 10% when it comes to public support for Medicare for all, you still have the overwhelming majority. So it really doesn't make sense to want to compromise. But here's what's happening. A lot of these politicians are starting to get cold feet. Sherrod Brown, Kirsten Gillibrand, Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren. Why? Because fighting for Medicare for all is something that you really have to be firmly committed to, because it will be the most difficult political fight of your life. And they know that. Fighting for Medicare for all means that you don't just have to go up against health insurance companies and lobbyists and money in politics and Republicans, but you have to go against your own party and actually wage war against them and become public enemy number one, possibly for decades, because even Nancy Pelosi's top aide is already assuring health insurance executives that they have nothing to worry about when it comes to Medicare for all. So that's cue for you having to knuckle up and fight your own party. And in addition to the intra-party warfare that will inevitably be catalyzed in the event we start fighting for Medicare for all seriously, you'll also face nonstop attacks from media outlets. Now, knowing how hard you're going to have to fight for Medicare for all, and then after just listening to Elizabeth Warren give a milquetoast answer to healthcare reform for 2 minutes, ask yourself this. Do you really think Elizabeth Warren is someone who is willing to do what she has to do to get Medicare for all codified into law? You and I both know that the answer is no. So just because I like Elizabeth Warren and support her doesn't mean I'm going to handle her with kid gloves. When Kamala Harris started to backtrack on Medicare for all and started talking about this nonsense of, oh, there's multiple paths to Medicare for all, I called it like it was. And I'm going to be objective and hold Elizabeth Warren to the same standard. She's starting to walk back her support for Medicare for all. This is incredibly disappointing. Elizabeth Warren is the candidate that just continues to disappoint, because even if she does the things that we like, this wealth tax on assets, and proposes this bill to allow Americans to manufacture generic drugs, she still does these things that are just overwhelmingly disappointing to progressives, stemming back to 2016. She doesn't have the political courage. She's not a leader. Is she an ally? Absolutely. And I have no doubt in my mind that in the event Bernie Sanders were to be elected president, she would back his effort for Medicare for all. But as a leader who has to take on the fight herself, is she the person who we can all instill our trust into that she's going to fight for Medicare for all 100%? No way. Not at all. And this is something that to me is unforgivable. You don't back Medicare for all, I don't support you. It's as simple as that. This is the ultimate litmus test. And these candidates right out of the gate are starting to fail that. And it's because we knew all along the only candidate who was serious about Medicare for all is Bernie Sanders and maybe Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang. But everyone else, they're not going to be real fighters here.
Mike is a total loser, so don't hit the subscribe button, okay? And whatever you do, folks, do not hit the notification bell either. Mike treats me so unfairly.